Hello, everyone. This is Shintai, and I want to welcome my guest, Alex Inigo. How are you doing, man?
Pretty good, Oscar slash Daniel slash Shintai. How are you doing today?
Just Shintai. We'll just keep it at that.
Okay. You have so many names, man. But anyways, like it's
I'm sorry.
anyways, it's really good to be here, man. I'm really excited for this interview, actually.
Yeah, definitely. So, Alex here used to work for Activision as a QA tester. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean that's among the other titles I have. Later on, I became like a floor lead and also a technical requirements guru. But we can all talk about that later and stuff, if you will, and kind of get into the nitty gritty.
Of course. Now, I wanted to talk to you because I find that there is such little opportunity to peer behind the veil of video game development. And since you worked at Activision and you were a active participant in the development of these games to a certain capacity, I think a lot of people would really enjoy to hear you ruminate over some of your past experiences, some of the games that you worked on, and generally speaking, just what was the goings on of your job and Activision at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like really super excited to be here and to talk about this stuff. I've never actually been interviewed for my time at Activision, which, to be clear, like there are a couple of things that you said in your statement just now. One, I wasn't technically actively part of development because technically QA actually is under the production umbrella. A lot of people think like, oh, like if you do QA in a company, that's you're in with the company. But the actual career progression, it goes from QA to floor lead to QA lead and then potentially like an associate producer or producer, which, it's not exactly making games, but they're some sort of responsible for it. And the other thing that you mentioned was that you said that I worked for Activision. It's yes and no. And the reason why is I technically did not work for Activision. I worked for Activision through a temp agency. Most QA analysts actually go through a temp agency, and we, from that point, we actually work for Activision through that agency. So technically, we're not on Activision's payroll at all. So it's a weird kind of like roundabout way of saying yes and no, but it is what it is.
Well, that's what we're here for, right? We're here to get a clear perspective on this sort of thing.
Right.
And the first question that I have for you is, what is the criteria needed to work at a video game company?
Well, that's kind of a bit of a broad question because you can be if you're in QA, you're trying to be in QA. A lot of people think that that's like the entryway into the industry. Yes and no. If you're a good enough animator and you're a great modeler and stuff, you can actually just skip that step of going through QA and actually start doing modeling and stuff.
I'll modify the question then and ask, what do you need to do specifically to get into QA?
Do you know how to write? Do you know how to hold a controller or use a mouse and a keyboard? That's really it. And I might sound like snooty a little bit. I hope I'm not coming across that.
No.
Okay. But like typically QA analysts are people who are or have probably been are probably in school for that matter. And they need like some sort of way to pay the bills or something like that. So those are the kinds of people who tend to apply to these sorts of positions. In other words, it's not like this high paying position, what have you. It's it's not something to aspire to, but it's essentially I guess in the production side, the first step towards becoming a producer. To be able to understand like the goings on in the industry from the lowest level. And really for that, you need to be able to, have basic reading and writing skills, be able to actually identify step by step, how you were able to do something to in order to break the game, for example, or even just in general, like be very observant and perceptive about what's going on in the game as you're playing it. QA is one of those jobs where a lot of people think like, hey, you're just there to play games. Well, yes, that's about 10% of it, but 90% of it is doing the things that other gamers won't think of doing. And if you've never actually tried to break a video game in your normal day-to-day life, oh boy, you're gonna be in for like a reality check here.
So let's get into that then. What is it exactly that one does in QA?
So in QA, what you actually do is you're there to do everything in your power to destroy the game. You're not there to play it from the beginning to end, although that is part of it, right? But you're there to make sure that regardless of what end users do, like us, when it gets to retail, that none of these like glaring bugs would actually destroy the game and crash and all that stuff. Now, this is kind of like a controversial topic because patches are now available on platforms, but there's another layer to that when it comes to console games, which is the submission process. Because if Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo find bugs in your games that literally just crash the game, well, that's like thousands of dollars down the drain. Because every single time somebody submits a game to any of the big three, you're always paying top money for them to test the game to make sure that, hey, you can release the game at this, this range of time. And if you fail, well, guess what? Like, you got to fix it. And you need to know how to actually, find it, if you will. There have been many, many parts, of my career in the industry where Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo would send us a bug and they'll try to list down exactly like how to replicate it, but we're not able to replicate it on our end. And actually we're actually going to have to like find it ourselves in order to fix it. But mind you, if this is a bad thing. If they find it, that's, again, I want to stress this, thousands of dollars down the drain, because that's just how the industry works. Now, obviously part of the game, or rather part of the job for that matter, is to play through the game beginning to end. But not only that, you have to test every single combination and aspect of it. Think of a game like, the first Spider-Man for PlayStation, the one that, Neversoft made.
Which you did work on.
I did work on, yes. There were 5 difficulty levels, right? And there's a ton of collectibles. We actually had to do what it's called a sprint and actually play through the game in all the difficulty levels, unlock every single thing in the game within a reasonable amount of time, because guess what? New versions of the game will just keep popping up and up and up and up. And if that's the case, then we have to delete the saves all over again, start from scratch as if it's a brand new game. It goes on and on and on. It's kind of a crazy process.
So that was actually something I was going to ask you later on. But I'm guessing that throughout the development of the game, you're sent multiple builds of it so that you can test it?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Has there ever been a case where you mainly worked on like a late build of the game before release, or that's not how it works?
So the interesting thing is that you're always working on builds of games, even if you've submitted it. Because if you think about it, back in the day when I was working on games, we would work on the US build first, and then even when we were waiting for the approval process for Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft, we're already working on the European versions of the game, which we call FIGs, eFigs, which is French, Italian, German, Spanish, and English for the UK. And they have their own submission process that we have to worry about. So, so really, like, not only is it multiple builds of one country for the game, sometimes we could be working on it concurrently. And of course, as I mentioned, since there are the big 3 and possibly PC, maybe 4 versions of the game as well for 4 different platforms, So it's quite the process. But going back, and the reason why I noted Spider-Man for PlayStation was because during that era, especially with that game, we didn't work on the Nintendo 64 version or the Dreamcast version until we had finished the PlayStation version first. Then, after all of that was done, we decided, let's move this game to the Nintendo 64 and let's work on getting that, taken care of next. So it's not a situation like right now where a lot of companies try to make games across different platforms at the same time, which, if you want, we can talk about that as well, because I do have a story about that as well.
Sure, go ahead.
So I also worked on Ultimate Spider-Man, which, that's not a surprise that I worked from a Spider-Man game and then another one later. It just meant like I had experience playing it. But that game was actually concurrently being made for the original Xbox and the PlayStation 2, and I want to say the GameCube as well. I'm not really sure. I'm really hazy on the details right now, but it was made for multiple platforms. And at first, like, I was on the PlayStation 2 team just to kind of get used to the gameplay of the game. But the most interesting thing about it, Daniel, is that, that time I was working on Graveyard Shift. Back when I was working on Spider-Man 1, there were only 5 testers for Spider-Man 1, and I knew everybody by name. One shift, just a day shift. By the time Ultimate Spider-Man came around, there were actually 3 shifts of people, a day, a night, and a graveyard shift working. And mind you, I don't know if that's actually still happening right now in Activision, right? But this was the situation that I was in. And there were at least about 50 people for Ultimate Spider-Man for the graveyard shift when I started. And that's just for, like, any version of the game.
The QA team can vary wildly in terms of size depending on the game.
Absolutely. And also, if you notice, like, we were working on Ultimate Spider-Man on 3 platforms at the same time. So compared to, like, the original Spider-Man game that we made where there was only 5 people, now it's up to 50, which, those people are being, kind of moved around depending on, like, what version or platform of the game they were going to be working on that day.
I was also wondering, do you work, like, directly with the developers of the game when you QA it to fix bugs?
So the way that it actually works, and this is kind of like, I think, for most companies, is that we enter all our bugs in a database. And once the bugs are in the database, the floor lead is responsible for going through all the bugs in the database to make sure that they're readable, they make sense, and, so that way they could also forward the high priority ones to production. Production then actually sifts through the bugs, looks at it, and sees the priority of what should be fixed, and those are actually sent to the developers themselves. From time to time, the QA leads, the production and development go in a call, or even a face-to-face meeting, depending on where they are, and actually talk about the prioritization of the bugs. So if there are, like, minor bugs, like, for example, that don't crash the game, that generally is either production's call or the development's call to try and not fix it because they don't have time. And it's not necessarily QA's fault, because chances are QA has caught it. It's just that the higher ups decided that it would be too much, work to try to fix it.
That makes sense that it would go based on priority. The bigger bugs that break the game would be more important than something that is, benign, like a visual glitch or an audio glitch or something.
Mm-hmm. Like a flickering texture. That's not really high priority, right?
Yeah. Compared to something that, like, oh, you picked up a key item and then the game stops working.
Right.
How much leeway do you have in regards to what games you work on?
None, actually.
None. Okay.
None. Like, you basically, like, don't get to say, like, oh, I want to work on Quake 3, which actually, the funny thing is, when I started at Activision for the first time, Quake 3 Team Arena was being tested, but it was behind a locked door with its own key card, and the only people that can actually be playing the game are the people who are inside that room. And, of course, as history has pretty much told us now, Team Arena is out, and you guys know what it's all about. So there's no secret anymore. But at the time, it was like a big hush hush secret thing, like the quote unquote only the chosen ones get to talk about or play Quake 3 Team Arena, and at the time I don't even think we knew what it was. It was just like this weird group of people who would just wander into this room with their own key cards and play games in like a darkened room where there's like shutters and blinds that are always closed, so it's an interesting time.
That sounds oddly appropriate for Quake.
Yeah. Now, here's the funny thing, though. That happened again, actually, later on, during like the transition to the to the 360 and the Wii and the PS3 era. Actually, when I worked on Call of Duty 3, the PlayStation 3 was just about to come out, and the Wii was just about to come out. They did the exact same thing for Call of Duty Wii. Like, the exact same thing. They only had 3 people in a room testing Call of Duty 3, and I was one of those lucky people who basically, said, like, hey, I know how to edit a Quake 3 configuration, because it's not really a secret that the Call of Duty engine is basically Quake 3, but heavily modified. So, like, somebody, like, came into our room and asked, like, hey, who here knows how to edit Quake 3 code? We need you for like the Wii, Call of Duty testing thing or something. Or we need you. They weren't being specific. They just said we need you. And so I said, all right, I'm here. I can do it. So for like one day, I was in the Call of Duty Wii team, like playing the game, of course, like enamored as everybody else because it's the Wii. It's the brand new thing, motion control, right? And but it was so new that I literally was on a keyboard editing what each gesture should do in the game. That's how crazy it was.
That sounds really cool.
It is, actually. And, if anybody out there who's listening actually has Call of Duty 3 for the Wii, I actually invented the 3rd configuration. And I'm proud of that because all of the other configurations, in order for you to throw the grenade, you hold a button and you use the Wiimote to actually throw the grenade, which, the Wiimote is also how you aim in the game. But what I actually did was, while you're aiming the Wii remote, you can use the nunchuck and kind of flick it, or actually do like the grenade throwing motion, and wherever you're aiming with the Wiimote, that's where you're actually throwing the grenade. For some reason, nobody actually thought that was a good idea, but I was really happy that my configuration survived the release anyway. So if you love playing with that config, that was mine.
Awesome. Now, you were saying before, because had worked on Spider-Man on the PS1 up to now, Call of Duty on the Wii. So I have to ask, how much did, I guess, the scene changed between that time? Because that's across 3 generations, basically. So how did things change? I would imagine, 3 different gaming generations, things must have been pretty different from how you started compared to how around when you left.
Oh boy, did it ever. The fondest memories that I have of my time in QA was actually around when I worked on Spider-Man for PlayStation, because that was a really unique time, because our team, there was only 5 of us in the team, like literally, like there were 5 testers, there was a lead, there was a floor lead, and there was a QA lead. But I will never forget that one time where our producers actually sat us down in a boardroom, and they asked us like what we think should be added to the game. And, we just shot around ideas and stuff, and they were all implemented into the game, like really easily. Like, I want to say like we said like, yeah, it'd be cool to have like comic books collectible and stuff. And, and they put it in there. You can collect comic books in Spider-Man. Like we were saying like, yeah, it'd be cool if there's different costumes. They did that, But then the crazy thing is that later on when I got back, and I was working on Ultimate Spider-Man. That was actually the first game I worked on coming back to Activision. And it was crazy because all of a sudden, like first of all, I was surprised there was a graveyard shift, right? Because I was expecting to work days. And then second of all, I was just, shocked about how huge the teams were, And mind you, like at the time, we were working in both times we were working in, in the same QA spot that I had worked on like back when I in the PlayStation 1 days. So in a way there was a sense of familiarity that was building, like when I walked into the same place and realizing, oh man, this is crazy. And also, seeing the same people that I used to work with many years ago. But the sea was changing like rapidly, because the first thing I thought of was like, wow, we literally have almost 100 people playing the same game across several different platforms. I mean, that's insane. Like I couldn't even remember everybody's names at that point. Like it was a very different environment to work on. There was a sense of personal, like personality and personalness that you could have had back in the PlayStation 1 days, because you knew everybody by name. Like it would, like maybe I'm assuming, I don't really remember, but like all of QA during the PlayStation 1 era, which includes, like all the platforms like PC and Dreamcast and all that stuff, there are probably less than 100 people just for like the entire QA department alone, which includes temporary people like myself. But now, literally, like 100 games is basically like just, or 100 gamers or QA people would just be for one game. And they were like kind of chomping at the bit to try to find more space, because at the time the space that we were in was so small for like the kinds of projects that we were undertaking at the time. We had a ton of different games that were like on the floor, and there were more coming in.
It sounded like it used to be more personable, and as time went on, as the industry grew bigger and bigger, I guess it became more corporate.
I think corporate isn't necessarily the right word for it. It's just
Okay.
that, because of the nature of QA, where it's always a revolving door of people, right? Because like I said, like if you're looking for like a college job, this was perfect, right? But like, like there wasn't really a set of people that whose sole purpose was to QA games. You're just basically hiring like little like kids. I don't want to say little kids, but kids from college who are in college that are playing games and want to kind of do QA. Like there's not a like specified skill, if you will. You don't have to be trained for QA deeply in order to do that. But because it's such a revolving door, you're always in need to retrain people and kind of almost like reinvent the wheel, so to speak. And since it's not really a lucrative career, especially on the QA level, it's like a lot of people do move on and try to get higher paid jobs within the industry. That's why a lot of people,
clearly, as you did.
yeah, and just, a lot of people say that, like it's the first step in video games. It sure is, because you will gain an understanding of how video game development works, even if you are just playing games, especially if you ask questions to your boss and all that stuff. But if you're thinking that you could just be QA forever, that's not the right frame of mind to think about.
I see. Yeah, it does seem like a pretty much an entrance level job, and it can be your first step in the door, or that'll be the end of it, depending on how you take it.
Exactly. Now, keep in mind, like, I loved my time there because the knowledge that I gained just by being, like, at the forefront of games was really, truly mind-blowing. Like, the things that I'm talking about now, like, I couldn't talk about it unless I had that experience. And I'm pretty sure many others who have had QA experience, like, can say the same thing, like, that they now have a truly deep understanding of what's going on, and the little bit of the politicking, but that really never affected me, But yeah, I think to going back to your question though, I did feel that there was less personal, like ties between people when more people got involved. In fact, some of the people like that I worked with, sometimes they just really didn't care about working, and and I'm not talking about the actual employees of Activision. I'm talking about like the other QA testers that I was with, right? Like like some people like just thought of it as like, well, we're playing video games. And it's weird because back in the PlayStation 1 era, everybody knew exactly what we were doing. We were testing to break games. We're not there to play them and enjoy them. I mean, that's the side effect if it's a really good game. But like the whole point is to break it so we get like a fully and amazing product. But of course, now when there's like 100 people for each shift, it's like, how are you going to police that? How are you going to make sure that everybody's actually doing the right work? You know, it becomes a challenging proposition.
Yeah, I think some people would probably go in with the misconception that, oh, you're just playing video games all day and not treat it as the job that it is.
Yeah, yeah, it really is a job.
Yeah, I would imagine. So, you worked on Pixar Racing, specifically the Game Boy Color version. So, how much involvement did you have in the game?
I mean, as much involvement as QA had, and you know that was the time that was around like the PS1 era where the we're transitioning to the Dreamcast and stuff. And I remember at the time that I wanted to be on the PlayStation 1 or the Dreamcast version because a lot of people were really excited because it was all cel shaded and all that stuff. But then when I got shoved to like the Game Boy one, and I was kind of a little bit disappointed because I was like, man, this doesn't look anything as good as those versions. Like, but you know, I think the most interesting thing is that when I started playing it, you know, and mind you, I was like pretty young back in the day, and I had no idea how people design games and stuff. I quickly kind of realized that what they were doing with the Game Boy Color version to make it work was that they literally took, you know, kind of like the equivalent of like JPEG photos of a really flatly rendered 3D track, and then basically the engine would just kind of slideshow the track, you know, into the Game Boy Color, almost like test. Is it Test Drive? I think it's Hard Drive-In for. I think it was a Super Nintendo game or like a PC game and stuff where they had like 3D, but it's not really 3D in a way. It was like really low polygon 3D. Like the Toy Story Racer, I think that's what it's called, did something similar to that. And then, so basically, what that means is you can't actually turn your car around and go the reverse direction because you're always perpetually moving forward. And eventually, like I kind of, you know, started loving the game because it was so unique, and it was like, you know, they were trying to be creative with trying to make this work for the Game Boy Color. And, you know, but as far as like my involvement with the developers, it's the typical QA relationship. You write the bugs, you know, we submit the bugs and stuff to, you know, to our database, and those guys at the leads like essentially talk to those guys. And like I said, like the Neversoft like relationship that my team had with Spider-Man QA, that was very unique because that literally was them asking us questions, which I don't actually think I've ever had that kind of communication with devs at all after that.
Interesting. So, generally speaking, when it comes to QA, there's a very distinct line of separation between the QA team and the development team, and that was kind of a rare exception.
Yes, that is absolutely a rare exception because we felt at the time that Spider-Man on PlayStation 1 was a passion project by everybody involved. And, you know, we wanted to make the best Spider-Man game because at the time, nobody had really definitively said that they've enjoyed a Spider-Man game. Like, you know, like I remember playing like Spider-Man for the Genesis and thinking like, oh, it could be better, you know? And so everybody involved was just so passionate about making that game really stand out that, you know, many years later, like I still meet people that said like, hey, you worked on Spider-Man for PlayStation, that was like my favorite. And I was like always flattered to hear people like say that was you know, their favorite Spider-Man game, even though of course there have been other better ones, but I smile every time I hear that all the same.
Well, I did rent the N64 version as a kid, so
I worked on that too. Crazy. It's crazy that we're here many years later. And you're like, yeah, I would have never thought like I would actually talk about my work too. And it's kind of like this weird like, hey, it's been years already. I think it's time to actually talk about it situation. And,
Mm-hmm.
there were moments during those times where I feel like there were, backstage politics because there were favoritism that happens, of course, as with most jobs. But, right now all I can think about is really, despite that, it was still kind of a fun experience. Like, I really enjoyed my time there. I mean, how crazy would it be to be, to be interviewed right now for like a job you did, gosh, like decades ago, right? It's crazy.
Yeah. I know, and I never would have thought, especially at the time playing Spider-Man, that I'd get to talk to someone that worked on it. That's nuts.
It totally is. It totally is. There's so many stories I could tell from those times too, but you know.
Well, actually, that was one of my final questions. I wanted you to just kind of tell us a few of those stories. What are some stuff that happened during those times that that you really feel like expressing?
So, I mean, obviously, I think meeting Wood Neversoft, or at least the producers of the Spider-Man game, was really, really cool, right? Like, that's something that I'll never, leave my brain. But there was one particular event that happened in Call of Duty 3 that I was extremely, extremely proud of. Because, again, as I mentioned, there were hundreds and hundreds of people actually working on the game at the time. Like from a day shift, night shift, and graveyard shift. Again, I don't know how the structure is now, but I'm pretty sure it's much different. But, we had submitted the game to, the big three and stuff. And one of them basically said, like, well, we can't allow the game because we found this bug. It was a major crash. Well, actually, it wasn't a major crash. It was what you call a progression break, which is, essentially like you play the game and there's absolutely zero way that you can actually finish the game in that current state, right? There's
Right.
there's no way back. And for, to respect my NDA, which I'm still tied by it to some degree, I'm not going to describe the exact way to, to replicate it, right? Either way, it doesn't matter because it's fixed. So, at the time we got the report back from the company, from the first party, and day shift and night shift desperately tried to find the reason why the game would have the progression break. None of them could find it. And so I finally went to work, that day. I was the floor lead of the game. And so, so all the leads, including myself, basically like started talking about it and stuff. And they're like, yeah, we tried this, we tried that. What do you think we should try? And I said, like, well, we'll do something stupid, like, and this is gonna, and my, my QA testers are gonna hate me, but essentially I'm gonna basically force them to play all the difficulties, never die a single time, but die in a specific section and try to play through that section again. Because I had this weird feeling that maybe it has something to do with the state of the game after dying, and so like, one guy like flagged me down many hours later and said like, hey, I was able to do it. And I'm like, really? And so I went over to his station and I asked, like, so what did you do? It's like, I did what you asked. I basically like did this difficulty and played to this section. Then I died and reloaded and tried to play, and I couldn't progress anymore. I'm like, that's great. Somebody else try it. And so by like mid shift, everybody who had tried it was able to replicate the issue 100%. There was not even a doubt in everybody's minds that this is the way to do this. And, I got a pat in the back, and then I left the company and finished college. Yeah. So, yeah, that was my claim to fame. Like, people were, like, asking, like, are you going to come back? I'm like, I don't know. I don't like being paid almost, like, pretty low. I want to make like a lot of money, man. But it was fun because in a way, just even finding those issues that the first party had, which mind you, like you don't want that scenario to happen where the first parties basically like return and say, hey, you gotta crash or whatever. But in that specific sense, it's almost like it became a game, and I made finding it into a game, which, since everybody was kind of like in this mindset that they were here to play video games, might as well make it a fun endeavor, right? Like, yes, we're working really hard, and I know that it's like, ridiculous, to be working on this in a graveyard shift, but I could have everybody, I could have everybody's back and say, if we find this, we're going to be kick-ass, and we're going to basically beat the snot out of day and night shift. So I even made it into a competition in a way. And we did, and we kicked ass. And, people were like, good job, man. I'm like, no, that's not me. It's my QA testers, man. They were the rock stars here.
That's awesome. That's a cool story, man.
Yeah.
Now, this is something that I've always thought about, and that is because I'm seeing some of your games here, and I'll go ahead and say the ones that you've worked on. You worked on X-Men Mutant Academy. Obviously, we've discussed Spider-Man. You worked on Star Wars Demolition, which I think that's like a battle racer type of game.
Yeah, it was like a Twisted Metal game that was made by the Vigilante 8 guys.
Right. There's Disney's The Lion King, Simba's Mighty Adventure, the Disney/Pixar Toy Story Racer, which we also discussed, True Crime New York City, Ultimate Spider-Man, and Call of Duty 3. So, again, something that I've always thought about, which is like, because you're a QA tester, you didn't make the games, but you are a part of the process. So I have to ask, how does it feel when you're saddled with one of these games and you just hate it? Like the game sucks. Like you just, I can't believe I'm saddled with this game. Like has that happened to you?
It has, and more than once actually. And they think the most interesting thing is how much feedback the developer wants from QA, because sometimes, especially early on in the process, they will allow you to actually give suggestions on how to improve the gameplay. There were some of these games where I jumped into the actual QA that I was so late in the process that I couldn't actually give suggestions. But to me, it's really sad that, that part of it, the suggestion part of it, isn't something that a lot of people take advantage of. And actually other times, it's really sad when the wrong people actually give the wrong suggestions. The reason why I say it and phrase it that way is because there are, how like sometimes these days, like there's something called like armchair game developing and stuff like that. Like it's similar to that. It's making the wrong decisions based off of, like people who might not be experienced enough to know what is right for your game. And sometimes some developers have the notion to be like, oh, let's take this guy's suggestion. This sounds really cool. But they're A, unable to execute it, or B, it's just the wrong fit for the game, right? Like, we've had weird, like, my experience with this kind of problem was, actually I encountered this really early on. My first project at Activision was actually X-Men Mutant Academy, which is a fighting game. And I was so sad because out of everybody who's played the game, who's actually tested it, I was the only one who literally was part of the FGC. Like, I would go to like Family Fun Arcade, which is a really popular spot in like the West Coast, play Marvel vs. Capcom 2. In fact, I even brought my copy of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 at the office so that I can show people what a quote-unquote real fighting game was all about.
Throwing shade.
Exactly, right? But I wanted to kind of get them to understand the fundamentals of fighting games. But at the time, I wasn't, mentally prepared to be able to undertake that or explain it properly. And so a lot of their suggestions were like, hey, like Sabretooth is too weak, up the damage. And I'm like, no, you shouldn't up the damage. He's already, doing so much damage. And so the balancing of X-Men Mutant Academy was built upon one guy who knew what he was doing because he played fighting games, and that would be me, and the other people who basically have played Street Fighter casually, like here and there. And maybe they could do a fireball, maybe they can't. Maybe they can do a combo, maybe they can't. And that's why the game is the way that it is. Now,
that makes me sad knowing that there were people in QA that didn't even know how to do a Hadouken. Like,
yeah.
Man.
I mean, eventually later on, like, you know, the company got really good at asking people what kinds of games they're good at, and they would be, you know, like, and you asked that question earlier, if you had some form of control of what project you could be in a way there is, because they, you know, they've obviously later on learned a lesson that we're not going to put a guy who's really good at sports, you know, to play, like, I don't know, like a puzzle game or some weird thing like that, right? Like,
Right.
it has to
Yeah.
be a perfect fit. So certainly later on, people have learned, like, okay, yeah, we need to match you with the right game that will, you know, that your skills will complement, you know. So
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. To,
mhm.
like you said, it doesn't make sense to get someone who's great at sports games and saddle them up with a puzzle game. It needs to play into their strengths in order to be able to tap into what it is that makes that game tick. And then that way they'll be able to find what's wrong with it.
And actually, I just realized that I kind of skirted around a question.
Okay.
But I guess at the time when I was like, the Lion King game comes to mind. I didn't want to be in that game. Like, I didn't want to
Oh,
work on that game. I had other games that I wanted to be a part of, but it allowed me to actually reconnect with an old colleague of mine who I worked with, incidentally, on X-Men Mutant Academy. And we were actually able to work together. And that was my last project before I got moved up to a different position that actually helped me learn a new side of QA, which was technical requirements. And, you know, there are different kinds of positions within QA, and technical requirements is actually a little bit higher than QA. Like, you are in your own department, if you will. But I don't know if most companies have that sort of difference. I think they call it compliance these days. But yeah, I had that opportunity, which is kind of crazy.
do you mind describing the different positions in QA that you were in?
Oh, certainly. So QA tester is or analyst. A lot of people say analyst to make it sound professional. You are a tester, regardless of regardless of what you call
Hmm.
yourself. This is the big shebang. This is your entry level position. You play games with the hopes of destroying it or crashing it, right? You do the most ridiculous things. You can spin the camera around, you can mash the buttons. By the way, if you do want to go into QA, the most common bug that I've ever encountered that they get fixed, right? Is if you mash buttons during the loading time. Because sometimes what happens is the game actually is, if it's like super early in the development cycle, the game is still accepting inputs. And because you're buffering so much input, once the game finally loads, you can crash it or destroy it right away. It's
Oh, wow.
a little bit of a tip. I think that was like the most common bug that I found, which of course got fixed. But so that's QA. Technical requirements. I think other companies call it compliance, and what that is you have to basically make sure that your game meets the specific requirements of each of the big three and your company as well. So in other words, there's a checklist that Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo provide you, your company, and you have to fulfill those requirements. These are really silly requirements. So like, we're talking about proper PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo branding, proper casing of the word PlayStation, how you should represent the buttons on an Xbox controller, how you shouldn't have a PlayStation logo on a PlayStation controller. That's an odd one. And so, like, you can imagine how silly this is, but essentially there are legal, there are functional, like functional requirements that you have to adhere to, that if you fail at any of them, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo will just be like, nope, this doesn't meet this technical requirement. And they'll put it, they'll name it on the technical requirements list, and then they'll fail you. Keep in mind that if you fail, like a few times, like within one testing phase, like sometimes it's okay, but it depends on the severity of it. So if it's like they find a lot of crashes and stuff, they'll just, or including that, you don't meet the technical requirements as well, like a lot of them, they'll just be like, look, man, like you misspelled the DualShock name, the casing is wrong, or there's no restricted symbol. Like they can kick that back to you at any point. It's kind of great. It's crazy, right? Like you think about it, that but that's what the technical requirements people do, or the compliance does, is they have to make sure from a legal standpoint and a technical standpoint that the game meets all those requirements before being sent to Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. And keep in mind, Nintendo and Sony, Microsoft have different requirements. And then, of course, internally as well. Like, let's say you have internal standards that you have to fulfill as well. Those are the guys responsible for meeting that. And they typically, are a group of veteran QA people as well. So they actually get their hands on a lot of games from different platforms, from PC, like Nintendo Switch or whatever. And yeah, those guys exist. And the last two QA positions are the floor lead and the QA lead. Floor leads are generally people that are being groomed to be the QA lead. The floor leads basically are the point man between the QA lead and the QA testers, and they're responsible for actually like editing the database to make sure that all the bugs are legible, all the priorities are actually correct. Like, for example, the flickering texture earlier that I mentioned, some people mark that high. So I'm like, okay, no, that's not high. That's a low bug. or if somebody suggests like, to add like a new feature and they have it as a bug, and I'm like, no, that's the wrong category, So that's the responsibility of the floor lead. And then, of course, the QA lead, their responsibility is to directly interface with production and development so that they know how the testing process goes. Like, like what's the progress in terms of progression? Like, are people able to finish the whole game? Are they stuck 80% of the time? Is veteran in Call of Duty 3 too difficult, or is it too easy? And, and they have a lot of meetings, regular meetings, actually daily meetings with production and development so that they know the state of the game, so that it's not this weird disconnection between them. I think that about does it for basically like QA roles. I think I covered it all.
Thank you. That was very in depth. I appreciate that.
I hope so. And again, like things might have changed over time, right? Like I'm talking about it from the perspective of the PlayStation 1 era to PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 2 to PlayStation 3, which are the eras that I worked on. So they might have changed it completely. They might have drastically changed things. And, because the last thing I heard was, there was a lot of talk about outsourcing, QA. So I don't know how much of that actually happens these days, but I'm pretty sure like there's a fair amount of that happening in general, like in the industry. So, and I'm not just talking about Activision.
So what games that you worked on do you recommend people listening to play the most? Which are the ones that you feel are most worth their time?
That's really tough.
Well, clearly you feel very strongly about the Spider-Man game.
Yeah.
The original.
Yeah. I would say that I'm very proud of X-Men Mutant Academy. And I know that sounds really weird after saying it's completely imbalanced, but Mystique was the character that I was responsible for balancing completely. And she is so strong in that game and actually very fun to play that you could tell like whoever actually was responsible for this character, like kind of knew like some fighting game stuff that really made her gameplay interesting. So I don't know how much it costs to get that game. It should be cheap. I think that's actually a pretty cool game to play. And actually, this might sound weird because it's like the black sheep of like the Call of Duty family, but Call of Duty 3 is actually something that I have fond memories with. If only because of that one bug that my team found, right? But also like that game is special to me because when I was working on that, I finally understood how Call of Duty was actually built from the ground up. That's when like we were talking about the gameplay in a very distilled and kind of like very granular setting. Like up until that point, I actually didn't know that the way that Call of Duty levels work is that you're basically filling an area like a battlefield with X number of people, and what you actually want to do is to keep pushing forward, or else you'll all the enemies will just infinitely spawn. And what the game will actually do is it'll throttle down the respawn rate for some of the battlefields, so that way you can kind of push forward a little bit. Also, I didn't realize this, but all the ammo in Call of Duty at the time was randomly generated, so it's not always constant, but enough so that you can actually keep shooting. And so like there were so many of these things that I was learning about the design of the game that I truly appreciated what that core gameplay was, even beyond like what I was playing before, like, you know, in Call of Duty 2 or Call of Duty 1. And even funny enough, when I started playing Call of Duty 4, which of course is everybody's favorite Call of Duty, you know, all that knowledge that I had built up working on the game kind of came back to me, and I was able to be like, yep, that section you actually want to get pushed forward because you'll just have an infinite amount of enemies. Naturally, Call of Duty is different these days. They don't do that stuff all the time anymore. They do some really weird stuff, but like it was fun. Also, like it had vehicles. If you had like the Xbox 360, PS3 version of the game, you had vehicles too. So that was a fun thing to test, actually.
Before we wrap up, I remembered earlier in the interview you had mentioned something along the lines of that one of the games you worked on, that was your final project, and that you had moved on to college. Do you want to expound on that a bit and talk about what your thought process was at the time and why you decided to leave?
Sure, absolutely. So at the time, I was in the process of transferring to a university, and and even though like I made such a huge mark by finding that one bug, like in Call of Duty 3 and stuff like that, and I was actually being considered for a possible promotion. Now, possible is kind of like a tricky word, because possible could mean maybe a year from then or 2 years from then. But regardless, I had talked to a lot of my friends during that time, and I've heard like some of them have been there for like 3, 4, or 5 years, and it was just it's just very challenging and very competitive, and for a fraction of what I feel I should be earning, right? Like I had like this very clear notion of like what I should be earning in the company, for especially for the kind of work that I was doing. But the
You
sad
felt it wasn't adding up.
right. It wasn't a living wage, so to speak, so that I can have my own place and stuff, like that sort of situation. But that's kind of like the par for the course for QA, though. Is these guys are the unsung heroes of gaming, because they basically write every single bug and stuff, and it's not their decision to get it fixed, and they can fight it, we can fight it and stuff. And that's kind of the interesting struggle that we didn't get a chance to talk about between QA and development and production and stuff, is there is that struggle between all three of those companies and those departments, if you will, to make sure that the game comes out right, and each of them have different visions. And I felt also, I think the bigger reason why I had left is because at the time I was working, like when I was working on PlayStation 1, we would have maybe like another 8 hours overtime in the weekend from time to time and stuff. But by the time that we were doing like the PS3 and all and the new platforms and stuff, we were averaging about 60 to 70 hours a week of work. And that's, to me, that's really insane. And I worked really hard during that time to make sure that every single hour counted, and not only that, like I had to basically like lift the morale of my team, and that's quite a burden. And while I'm going to say right now that I had a lot of fun actually having that experience and stuff, again, for the kind of pay that we were getting, it's not enough.
I can understand if you're working so hard, so many hours, and you're not getting paid. I mean, regardless of whether you were enjoying it or not, we all need money to live. And if you were putting so much time into it, you deserve to get the amount of money back that you feel that you put into it.
Exactly. And I think moreover too, like the biggest reason why I had left the industry is because I realized that I actually wasn't too interested in making games. Like, I had this dream when I was a kid that I wanted to actually create video games, as most of us do. But then, like when I became part of the system and stuff, like while I'm not saying that nobody should do it and stuff, I think everybody should try at least to do QA if you are interested in the industry. It's it's after that, it's after work, that's what affected me the most. Because I love video games, I love playing them and stuff. Like, I have a backlog of 700 or something games that I have to go back to. But what's funny is part of those 700 games actually were games that I had bought during my time at Activision in those two eras. Because I had realized that while I was buying all these games, 70, 60 hour a week work week, I had no time to play them. And in fact, I didn't feel like I wanted to play them anymore because I was so burnt out. Like, I'm literally looking at these, like, GameCubes, PlayStations, at 360s, like that, like all day, like for 10 or 12 hours a day, that I'm like, the last thing that I want to do is go home and stare at another screen, and I was really sad when I went home and, some big games were coming out, that were really, really good. And I didn't have, any sort of inkling to even play them.
That's a bummer. And I can, thinking about it, that makes a lot of sense. If day in, day out, all you're doing is testing bugs for games, I'm sure it would kill your enthusiasm to play games for fun because you're just stuck with it all day. I think some people, and I've gotten questions by people when I brought this up on Twitter, people asking about how they want to get into it. I don't think any of them are thinking about the adverse effects, such as this burnout that you felt at the time of not even wanting to play games anymore. I think that's sad.
Absolutely. And think about it, like people when they hear about QA and testing, they think that you have carte blanche on like what you can work on. No, I worked on Call of Duty 3 for 8 months. 8 months of the same game. I had no opportunity, or even nobody offered me to actually, hey, you want to go to our team first? No, I was playing Call of Duty 3 every single day, 70 hours a week for 8 months. Think about that. Like, do you think you'd be able to do that? Now, even if it's like the best game in the world, even if it's Persona 5, right? Like, let's say you were playing Persona 5 70 hours a week every single day for 8 months. At some point, even if you're the most hardcore player out there, you would burn out, right? I think so.
I would have to say so, especially me. I know myself. I
Mm-hmm.
There's only so much I can put up with a game, and then even if I love the game, there's after a certain point, I just need something different. I like to move on and have a fresh new experience.
Right. Couple that with the fact that maybe you're the guy who has to do sprints, basically like you are tasked with completing, like let's use Persona 5 as an example. You are tasked with finishing the game as fast as humanly possible so that when the next build comes, you could do the same thing over and over and over again. How would that make you feel? That's what actually most of what the testers had to do when playing and actually testing video games. It's not a job for everybody, and it's certainly not something that I would advocate everybody to do. But again, but if you are really curious about how things work, that's certainly like a great, experience to have.
Honestly, I gotta say, I'm someone that really loves to take their time with games. I would hate that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's other ways, like, but again, this is beyond I feel like that's beyond the scope of our conversation. There are many ways that players that can take time, like, can contribute to QA process. But, like, you could be like the guy who goes around every single corner of a level to make sure that everything works, right? Like, you won't just walk off the face of the planet, for example. But at the end of the day, burnout is a real thing, and that's exactly what happened to me. And it's because of that burnout that I thought to myself, well, if I want to make a game and it would take me 4 years to make a game, I better make a pretty kick-ass game, or else I would hate myself for it. And that's when I realized, like, I love playing games. I think I'm, like, even though, like, I may be critical of a lot of games out there, at the back of my head, I'm always hoping, the best for any sort of game. It could even be games that I don't like at all, because now I know, being in QA, I know how difficult games are made, like how games are pretty much made, like how difficult that process is. And man, realizing that you worked so hard for long hours to have this reception, that you can't plan that. You can't plan that at all.
But moving past that, I mean, what are you doing now? I mean, I'm sure people have gone through this journey with you, your QA journey. That was between the year 2000 to 2006. So what are you doing now? I mean, that was a while ago. So I'm sure people are curious as to what's been going on with you recently.
So I'd mentioned that I love games, and that hasn't really stopped. In fact, I am a recovering backlogist. I don't even know if that's a word. I have a lot of games. Like I mentioned, like I have a ton of video games that I've been playing and kind of catching up during that time, right? So I've amassed such a huge library, including of new games, that I kind of decided to kind of share that passion with people. About 4 years ago, I actually started a podcast with a really good friend called the Backlog Battle Podcast. I think it's aptly named. And actually, incidentally enough, you're the new co-host of the show because he had to leave and, focus on other endeavors as well. Speaking of other endeavors, right?
I was going to say, hey, wait a minute. This backlog thing is starting to sound kind of familiar.
I know. And yeah, it's kind of funny how that works. And, we've collaborated many, many years ago on similar podcast endeavors. And I kind of decided recently to kind of try my hand at YouTube again. And kind of really show, like that I love games. Like I love all sorts of games, and hopefully like I can contribute to the larger YouTube gaming population, if you will, and kind of show like maybe a different side of games that I have seen using like the experience that I had in QA and stuff. Maybe, even if it's just like, hey, making fun of, some of the decisions people made when it comes to games, or being a little bit critical about, some of the other decisions people made, like there's interesting conversations to be had about video games every single day. And, the Backlog Battle YouTube channel, which is the YouTube channel I started, is all about a celebration of video games, from the being critical of games, like the critical side of it, right? Like being a reviewer or all that stuff, to like just finding the best moments in games, like the first hour. Like, there are games that really grab us and stuff that kind of, gives us that really good first impression. That's what my Try Play video series is all about. And of course, like something that I've been kind of toying with is the series called Backlog Battle Bits, which, like I recently released a video where I talked about like how I love cooking games, and people might not even have that in their radar as a game genre. But, so I decided, hey, you know what? It's a cool genre to play. Let's see what people think about it. And so it's all aspects of games that I really am passionate about, and am curious if other people are passionate about as well. And so, it's called Backlog Battle because, yeah, we all have backlogs, right? Hundreds, maybe thousands of games.
Oh, God. Yes, I do. So if you enjoyed listening to Alex and I talk, don't worry. The podcast is a little more balanced. This was an interview style type of thing. So if you enjoyed this, I would say to please go over to the Backlog Battle channel and listen to the podcast, either on the YouTube channel, or you can listen to it on Stitcher and iTunes.
And Google Play.
You can listen to the two of us banter about video games and whatever else we feel like talking about. Sometimes we feel like talking about other stuff too. It's mainly video games. But, in one episode, we talk about The Disaster Artist because why not?
Yeah, why not? I'm not even gonna get into that. I think I'll leave the listening part for your viewers and stuff for that.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining me on this. This was awesome. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining me. This has been Shintai. Take care, everyone.